So I am going to talk about the morphology or the, oh, what happened there? Okay, I'm going to talk about the loss of morphology and the emergence of analytic structures in Chinese. And this is like, there's some debate recently, particularly recently, that there is a development of Chinese from a more analytic to a more synthetic to a more analytic language, as we have heard just in the preceding talk. And there are several papers on this, particularly by Jim Huang, and one paper by Ian Robertson, Jim Huang, and Feng-Sheng Li argued for this for many, many years now, from a kind of prosodic approach, which assumes that there was some kind of morphology in Chinese, so affixation in Chinese, in ancient Chinese, but which caused a particular syllable structure, a B-moraic syllable structure, and when this morphology disappeared, the language changed and became more analytic. But this research has not really been connected to the research on like kind of the reconstructed morphology for Chinese, which is a very, very messy research subject. And so my talk will be very, very preliminary. I try to approach it from a kind of different perspective, and then in the future, I want to establish a kind of database for all these kind of morphological markers in order to search where they actually appear in order to try to figure out the system, but I'm not there yet. So this is all very, very preliminary. So the relevant property of modern Chinese is that they are overt light verb constructions, indicating a general property of high analyticity. So for instance, typical cases are something like da yu, do fish. So you need da as a light verb, or da dianhua. So it's very, very productive to phone, in contrast to English, which does not have this. So correct Chinese has then been compared to English. And in this example, you can see that we have yu, to fish, like fishing in a deep swirl as a verb, and we have yu as a noun, get fish. So this is later correct Chinese, and in later correct Chinese, in the correct Chinese in general, we do not have these overt light verb constructions as a rule. So the changes in the VP in Chinese, so it's all, I'm only talking about little VP here today, is attributed to the loss of this kind of former affixation in some part of the literature, to phonetic simplification, changes in the prosodic structure of the word, and so on. And there are many, many, many different proposals for the function of the affixes of archaic Chinese. We will see this with respect to the suffix s. So we have morphological marked causatives in the correct Chinese, and I actually changed my approach from what I proposed in my abstract. Looking at these kind of examples, I found actually not so many clearly only causative examples. So I am now talking about resultative, so the race head according to Ramchand. So here you can see we have yuan in the fourth tone, and we have yuan in the rising tone. Yuan in the rising tone is an adjective. Adjectives are always verbs in Chinese. This is important to remember. And we have this used causatively in the Tushang. We are going to talk about verbs with Tushang for the rest of this talk. And then in later literature, so in early Middle Chinese, we have overt, like kind of causative constructions. I'm not going to talk about these overt causative constructions now at all. I'm only talking about morphologically marked resultatives and how they change. So here we have, and often we have these kind of alternating forms. So we have a verb in any tone, like here, govern, to order, and then we have it in the Tusheng, in the falling tone, song zhe. Song was well ordered. And this has been reconstructed with an S suffix. And then in Middle Chinese, in early Middle Chinese, we have a tendency to have something else, kind of marking something like resultative. And E is one of these features. I will very, very briefly talk about that. And in modern Chinese, then we have an entirely different structure. We have ca, gan, le. So we have a verb indicating some kind of activity, action, and we have a result, and then we have a perfective marker, also called like kind of realization marker, for instance, by Sebesma. And this structure, these new structures, they all emerge at the beginning of the early Middle Chinese period. And I propose that this has been triggered by the loss and the total opacity of this former morphology. Okay, so we have all kinds of different affixes that have been proposed in the literature. So we have a prefix S, which is supposed to be causative, a causative prefix. I'm not talking about this. We have the suffix S, but for instance, for readings related to resultativity, we also have a prefix which causes a voicing alternation. I'm also not going to talk about this one. I'm only talking about the suffix S, which has been discussed under the label derivation by tone change, meaning there's an alternation of stems in one of the three tones with another one in the falling tone. And this falling tone has been proposed to have developed from an S coda, which weakened to a H and then further to the Tushan already in the 1950s. And usually nowadays, so like in the more recent literature, there are basically two functions that have been associated with this S. So the one is a valency increasing kind of causative function, and the other one is a valency decreasing function, which has been connected to passive, to perfective, and to resultative, which is in little VP. And just in order to show you how messy the earlier proposals were for this was that, for instance, Downer in 1959, so very, very early research on this, he proposed all kinds of different derivations for this S. So they're deriving nouns from verbs, verbs from nouns, causative, effectives, adverbals, and so on and so on. According to Jin, which is a very extensive study, so kind of lexical morphological study on these suffixes, the morphology of Chinese. He basically tries to subsume all these derivations under a change from imperfective to perfective aspect, meaning talking about some kind of outer aspect. And this was actually what I grew up with when I was a student of sinology, because my late professor Ulrich Unger in Münster also believed that. And they all relate this to the Tibetan system, so which has a very, in the earliest times of the written Tibetan documents, it still has a productive system of suffixation by S in several functions, including a nominalization function, which I didn't list here. So we have past and imperative, which is marked by this S suffix very productively. So here is the example we had before, once again, Sung Zhi, and thereupon Sung was well ordered, clearly resultative, has been then labeled as perfective aspect. The suffix S indicating an increase of valency often appears in alternations with rising tones. So we have seen this in the first example with yuan and yuan, be distant and make distant. And Jin, he describes this as a kind of giving derivation, and he claims that it's one of the major derivational classes of the S suffix, and it applies to many verbs with an outward reading, such as verbs of giving, helping. Meizulin also pointed this out very, very early on in the 1980s. So here we have examples: my, by, my, sell, shi, which is, you cannot look at the modern tones actually, so we always have to look at the Middle Chinese tones. So here we have look at and show, and many others like show, give and receive and things like that. So the basis of my research is the Glossar des klassischen Chinesisch by my late professor Ulrich Unger. He gave me his database with his unpublished Middle Chinese reconstructions, and I tried to go through this database. I didn't entirely finish it, so I do not give any kind of relations, but it seems to be the case. The general relation is clear that there is about like a little bit less than 25% of Chusheng words in this database. And this can be confirmed by the word list by Baxter and Segar in 2014, which also has like 23% or so of Chusheng words in it. And according to Jacques 2012, this is way too many, because in Tibetan, we only have like about 13% of verbs with an S suffix. So he proposes a phonological rule accounting for this, but this is something that still has to be studied. So I'm just relying on what I found in this database. So you see we have verbs which are also adjectives at some point, verbs only, we have adjectives. And what I tried to find was when all the verbs which actually, so I just looked at the verbs, basically all the verbs which actually have or allow a kind of result reading in any ways or forms. And you can see this is an extremely high percentage. We also have a few semifactives, and we have very, very few verbs which are kind of difficult and which are causative without necessarily allowing a result reading. So this is kind of very hopeful for my general idea proposal here. Now some examples with kind of alternations of verbs and nouns. Chuan, noun, tradition, chuan, pass on, with verb, with adverb gung again, and verb gung, change. For lack of time, I'm not going into this, and just jump immediately into my discussion of the verbs. And as I said, I'm just talking about the S suffix, and my proposal is that the basic function of this is an overt raised head in the sense of Ramchand, with both those unaccusative, intransitive verbs, with ergative verbs, and with causative, transitive verbs. And this has been also inspired by the study of McFadden of 2015, where he proposes for the same for the Old English prefix ge, and the proposals he cites in the literature on ge sound very, very much like what has been proposed on the suffix s in Chinese. And so here are some examples like Geworte, for instance, for create. And so I will try to show you now that the function of s can be to a great extent reduced to this kind of function. So Ramchand, in her first phase syntax, she proposes 3 basic tests for the determination of a race phrase in the structure, the first phase structure of the verb, little vp. And one is a resultant state pp, which describes the final location of the undergoer resultee in a dynamic event. Another one in kind of non-explicit resultatives, where the rhematic position is already filled by a DP object, like enter the room. She proposes that they are incompatible with durational adverbals, like resultative verbs, but this is different in Chinese. So this test doesn't work very well in Chinese, because in Chinese we have durational adverbals with resultant states. So I will give you some examples for this too. And the third one, which we can basically see with all the examples, is an anchoring of the event structure to tense. Of course, we do not have an overt tense marker in most of the examples, or in later Chinese in any ways or forms. So, but we can still see that the result is focused, and that the entire event is basically depicted as punctual. And this is also supported by the employment of adverbs. So here we have some examples, and here we already have an example where we have a perfective adverb. We have the verb ding, establish, which only appears in the Chusheng. There might have been a related word in a different tone, but we are not sure about this, and it has definitely been written with a different character. And this E, this perfective E, views the entire situation as a kind of change of state, so just the change of state point and the state that's resulting from it. And here we have Zhen, consolidated, regulated. So these are the most straightforward cases where we have simple resultatives in unaccusative constructions in which the undergoer and the resultee are identical. There are more examples. Here we have Huan Sanyan Yi. So here we basically have one of these duration phrases. So he said, I have been employed for 3 years now, and so on. So here we have a result and the duration of the resultant state. And again, we have undergoer, resultee, identity. This is different in D, where we have initiator, undergoer, resultee, identity with tray, withdraw. In German, Unger translated this as sich zurückziehen, so this kind of German particular construction. So his dictionary is actually very useful for this. And here we have a similar structure to a verb like arrive in Ranchand, and we will see more of this. And the proposed structure would be that we have the two heads, the process phrase and the race P, and we have empire as being in the specifier of both of these phrases, and then the verb moves up or merges directly in the process part of the verbal structure of VP. Okay, now some tests with prepositions and resultant state prepositions. So in the first one, we have Zhao Zhuang Gong Yu Zheng. He called Yu Zhuang to Zheng. And this is also clearly a kind of result, including construction, where we have an initiator that's different from the undergoer and resultee, which are identical. And then we have also unaccusative or intransitive constructions, again, with just undergoer and resultee, which are identical. Fu zai wu shen, so the clothes are attached to my body. And all these reconstructions come from Baxter and Sagar. So, and we have intransitive verbs such as arrive, and here I just follow Ramchand. Of course, I have to do more tests and so on, but for the time being, I just follow Ramchand, at least for the first example where we have a proshuman subject. In the second one, we don't, so we do not have an initiator, obviously. So here we have a from prepositional phrase, but also leading up to the final place where the undergoer resultee is located. And the structure here for both, he called Yu Zheng to Zheng, and the king arrived from Zheng. So for both constructions where we have identity of all three and non-identity of the initiator is in 14C. So we have here identity, king, 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 arrive. And here we have a pro-subject. Subject position can be empty in later correct Chinese. And we have the undergoer, who is different from the initiator, but either identical to the resultee. And then we have the place P, a prepositional phrase indicating the resultant place. So now we come to the little bit more messy cases, although 51 is still very, very straightforward. We have the same verb as we had before, thing, but here now in a transitive construction where we have initiator and then again identical undergoer and resultees. And here, as in all cases, the same, a single lexical item identifies both process and race. And the event is expressed as punctual. And again, we have this adverb e. This is from early Middle Chinese. And then these structures become less transparent, and we have a huge increase of this kind of adverbial marking with all kinds of verbs, not just like these telic kind of verbs. This one is a little bit more complicated, so I just leave this out here. So now to kill the ruler and to profit from his fortune is both greedy and against the right. And there are lots of like kind of these transitive examples where the result is not entirely, whether it's not entirely clear whether they really have a resultative reading, but I assume that they do, and I will work on this.
5 minutes, so, Barbara.
5 minutes, yeah, I rushed through this. So I skip the similfactives and just go to the newly emergent structures to express prose, or race. So we have two different structures. The one is desyllabification in order to make the process or result heads of the verb visible, and then the emergence of the new syntactic structures expressing a result. One of the examples we have already seen. There are many, many examples, and this has been widely discussed for late archaic Chinese, but also for modern Chinese, of these constructions. So in archaic Chinese, we have zhe, arrive. In Middle Chinese, we already have wang zhe, or other kind of compounds where we have this kind of situation. And Bastiano also analyzes those in modern Chinese according to Ramchand's first phase syntax, and she proposes, in opposition to many, many other scholars, that actually modern Chinese has an overt raise head, which would be arrive in this case. So like the second verb would become the raise head. And here again, we have identity. This is not necessarily always the case. We have, for instance, with poor, break, we have da poor, hit and destroy, ji poor, attack and destroy. And here we have non-identity of undergoer and of initiator, undergoer, and resultee. So here we have, you see the undergoer, the resultee are identical, and we assume that destroy is the overt raise head and the process part is made visible. The same accounts for zi, like in zi sha. And now very, very briefly on the new resultative constructions, we already had this E. This has been discussed widely in Aldrich and Meisterernst 2018. And there we have proposed an analysis according to Sibesma's analysis, like a small clause structure. But here I would rather propose that E is actually a raise head. Whether it is already grammaticalized from a small clause structure is a different kind of story. I will not go into this here. We have the same thing here again, which we had before, followed by E. So after the Samaya meeting was fixed. And here we have actually a combination. So we had tui before, and then here we have a compound shui tui. So bring down and make disappear as deteriorate, which is then additionally marked by E. And we also have transitive constructions like here. And the preliminary analysis for this would be that E is actually now occupying the raise head. The situation is different, like syntactically, from the compounds, because we can still have this word order without any movement of the verb or the E head to appear together. And it never happens with E. It only happens later with the modern suffix le. Okay, another one is the verb de, get, obtain, manage to, which also develops, grammaticalizes from a lexical verb into a resultative marker and later on into a post-verbal marker of potential and possibility. And I have proposed in a very recent talk that there is a grammaticalization from the lexical de to a resultative V2, which has a small clause in race P, again expressing result and realization, here following Chong and Sibesma 2004 on Cantonese da. And the verbs usually are verbs that only include initiator, process, heads. So this would be examples here where we have xue, so no resultative form, and also in late archaic Chinese. So we have xue de, learn and obtain the knowledge. But the argument structure needs to disappear. The argument structure of de needs to disappear for the fully grammaticalization as a resultative head and later on post-verbal marker, but this happens much, much later. And here we have one of the very, very early examples where we have shi de. It has been argued that this must be some kind of functional category because Yao can shoot at the sun, but he cannot really get it, obtain it. So this is the grammaticalization scenario basically of de from a lexical verb to a raise head. And I have not worked this out here for this purpose, just showing that there are different constructions which actually appear both basically at the same time, very, very strongly arguing from a syntactic perspective for the actual existence of this morphology and its functions. So this is a very preliminary. Yeah,
bring your remarks to a close. Thanks.
Yeah, this is very, very preliminary, as I have said, and so I propose that the basic function of this suffix is the overt morphological realization of a race head following Ramchand's first phase syntax. And it accounts not only for the intransitive and accusative verbs, so for something like ordered, which is obviously kind of resultative, but also for transitive causative verbs. And in early Middle Chinese, the function of this suffix has become entirely opaque for the language learner, and it's also disappearing and changing into the Chusheng. And different structures develop, which in different ways replace the former morphological marking of the race head. As I said, an overt race head has been proposed for modern Mandarin by Bastiano, and this, of course, is very, very hopeful for my kind of analysis. Okay, that's it. Thank you.